Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about Dark Comedy by Open Mike Eagle. So, okay, how many of you are absolutely sick of the songs about money, cars, drugs, and hoes in modern hip-hop music? You know what, look, I'm of the belief that you can talk about anything and everything you want in music as long as you do it well. But to say that certain subjects in rap music can wear me out shouldn't be all that surprising. I'm usually a fan of when rappers take established cliches in the mainstream or subvert them or heighten them for parody or satire, sort of like what Clipping or The Roots did on their most recent records, or when they can at least present the cliches impressively with good rapping technique, flow, or poetic language, or at least a couple good hooks behind them. I like some ignorant hip-hop, I'll admit this. I'll listen to some Kid Ink or some A$AP Ferg or maybe even some Iggy Azalea on occasion. I can dig it as long as it's got a good flow and a good beat. It works in a pop context. But you know what? There's another side to hip-hop outside of that brand of popular gangster rap. The vaguely defined yet endlessly interesting subgenre of alternative hip-hop that tends to avoid traditional rap cliches and draws upon richer wells for its instrumentation and style, like jazz or soul or reggae or electronica or even country and metal and folk. Originally arising in parallel with alternative rock through the late 80s and early 90s, it was unfortunately sidelined and shoved to the underground thanks to the fast rise in the more commercially viable, hard-edged gangster rap. Now thankfully, with the rise of the internet, most of these acts have risen to more prominence and even some critical acclaim, even if the radio doesn't want to play material all that intelligent or political or experimental, even if it might be a good fit for the radio upon retrospect. And at the intersection of all three of those adjectives that I said, you would find Open Mike Eagle, an alternative hip-hop artist originally from Chicago before going to LA. He first came to my attention in 2011 with his shockingly intelligent and genuinely unsettling record, Rappers Will Die of Natural Causes, partially because of his plain-spoken yet very attention-grabbing flow, showing buckets of charisma, partially because of his dark yet varied melody-driven production, and partially because there was a certain frank honesty and punch to his wordplay that spoke of real maturity and a knack for telling interesting stories and assuming that his audience was smart enough to keep up. Now, he followed that album with Animal Hospital, a much glitchier and darker record that pulled back somewhat on the humor and targeted more serious subject matter, like the financial crisis, articulated in plain, easy-to-follow language that was rich with references to history and culture that proved that Open Mike Eagle knew exactly what he was talking about and also did it better than most mainstream news outlets. So, okay, I know this review is almost a month late, but I knew at some point I just had to sit down and I had to discuss Open Mike Eagle's newest record, Dark Comedy. And for this album, I had to take my time and over a dozen listens to really unpack and decipher this album. I wanted to get it. I wanted to understand it. So, what'd I find? Well, this album hit me in a spot that I did not expect, and honestly, it's not going to be an album that will resonate with anybody because there are layers to Dark Comedy by Open Mike Eagle in terms of its content and its presentation that, I'll admit, really got to me. My struggle was pinpointing the exact reasons why it had hit me so hard, because this record is probably Open Mike Eagle's most honest and yet dense and interwoven album to date. And it also happens to be his best and currently jumped extremely close to one of my favorite albums of the year, bar none. Yeah, this album is that good. Go out and buy it if you haven't already. So, okay, you know what? Let's get my nitpicks out of the way, because the content of this album is far more interesting than any trifling complaints I have about production or lyricism. And honestly, I'm gonna be honest, they're trifling, really, because the few complaints I have about this record, they're pretty minor indeed. The first is more tied to some of the instrumentation. Open Mike Eagle's beats are often fuzz-saturated fusions of glitchy synth, psychedelic haze, and some classier instrumentation with unconventional beats, but there are a few moments that just got a little bit too abrasive for my taste. It might have worked a little bit better if they were a bit more stripped back. Idaho, for instance, it begins with a very minimalist arrangement and then brings in this wobbling, thick fuzz intended to intensify that feeling of being alone and uneasy at night. But I honestly thought the melody line was strong and unsettling enough to work on its own. It couldn't have conveyed the emotion properly, and the fuzz to me just cluttered the atmosphere. On a similar note, I thought the very shrill sample on A History of Modern Dance, it intensified the inherent awkwardness of the song just a little bit too broadly for me, especially when a slinkier vibe, a little bit more seductive, might have proved a stronger juxtaposition to some of the lyrical content, might have worked a little better. And well, I can't point to any lyrics that really exasperated me, outside of a couple chances where he rapped words with themselves, just a pet peeve of mine. There are a few points where on songs like Thirsty Ego Raps and Informations feel a little bit broad to me in some of their lyrical framing and presentation. Now, granted, I get the feeling that Open Mike Eagle is entirely aware of that. He himself says, "I'm bad at sarcasm, so I work in absurdities." And on first glance, this record seems to fit that statement to a T, because Open Mike Eagle's offbeat references, half sing, half rap delivery, which is pretty unconventional all things considered, especially considering he's not a stellar singer, and plain spoken delivery do reflect a certain modern comedic tone, the sort of dark, vulnerable comedy pushed by acts like Louis C.K. or Lena Dunham from Girls, that is sharply critical of society at large, and yet just as critical of themselves for being a part of that society. And on a stylistic level, the stripped back, muted beats and Open Mike Eagle's straightforward delivery is a damn near perfect fit. The beats always towing a very brittle balance between synthetic grit and organic instrumentation. I absolutely love the guitar balancing the noisy beat on Dark Comedy Morning Show, the rattling beat that sounds like bouncing dice in a cup on qualifiers, the ghostly shimmering production on Very Much Money and John Lovett's fantasy booking yarn, and that lonely piano on Big Pretty Bridges, all against the slightly distorted vocals. It's all done to accentuate this subtle feeling of being off kilter and off balance, all intentional to underscore some of the subject material of this album. And oh my god, we've got some meaty material here. On first, a very cursory surface level glance, many of the references to Open Mike Eagle makes in terms of pop culture are just plain absurdities, might come across as random, not making a lot of sense. I mean, Very Much Money has a running motif tied to Adventure Time of all things, and Doug Stamper Advice Raps is a direct link to House of Cards. But look a little bit closer and the references ring as just so much more intense and honestly much more disquieting. You can quickly tell from his delivery and his underlying content that while there are absurdities in some of his social commentary, they're the sort of absurdities that should make you take a step back and consider the really ultimately sad implications behind them. For the simplest of examples, for instance, take the line from Thirsty Ego Raps, "I'm the president of rappers who don't condone date rape." Yeah, sure, it's a boast, until you realize that Rocco, Rick Ross, and Future wrote a song last year with plain references to date rape just last year that was so terribly framed and out of touch with reality that by making that boast, Open Mike Eagle, he at least looks to be the exception in hip-hop, not the rule. His boasts aren't about money, but they're based upon his qualifiers, his wordplay, not his possessions, but how he frames and describes himself. Honestly, what the best kind of boasting in rap should be. And that's not counting all the songs where he writes about technology's ubiquity in modern life. But as a guy who spends 40 hours a week working in business intelligence, I can appreciate the underlying truth behind his songs, that behind all of that data collection, it's ultimately proving good in terms of some of our convenience for our life. We still accept it. And there still needs to be someone to analyze it. And there are so few people and companies have gotten anywhere close to that point that honestly, it's hard to see a sinister intent in any of it. It just comes across as more as benign and looking how small we are. Now this ties back to an element in the framing that I really loved. He places himself as the common man, and it's believable. And he does not distinguish himself by class, but by skill, which of course means that society continuously undervalues him and those people who would seek to do the same, just like him. Very Rich People is the plainest example of that, describing his friends with incredible talents, and yet who can't seem to get paid if they don't hustle or rap about hustling, instead using the Adventure Time motif of the Ice King's crown that grants immortality as a larger symbol of ego, and then points out the rappers who have worn that crown the longest, likely to their detriment, in rappers like Lil Wayne and Jay-Z, and how they themselves might have realized that ego has worn on them uncomfortably. And even that devaluing of intellect and skill, and even humanity itself, crops up all over this record. Doug Stamper, it's a great example of advice in that song that should seem like common sense, but the song is nuanced enough to recognize personal context is important, and that the advice might not apply to everyone, because those who have watched House of Cards know that Doug Stamper, the character, The advisor is racked with very human failings that play out over the 2 seasons, and is ultimately thrown aside when he could not detach farther enough, and he starts making mistakes, ultimately to his doom. It's almost to the point where on Golden Age raps, Open Mike Eagle describes exactly how one might be able to find some degree of success in modern rap, where art, represented by artists like David Lynch and Alan Moore, has been devalued to pure commercialism. A connection made all the more explicit on the song Death Mate Black, which directly references it. And that lack of detachment hits again on Jon Lovett's fantasy booking yarn, where Open Mike Eagles offered the dream booking on the moon, no less, from a sleazy promoter that you can easily imagine be playing by SNL's Jon Lovitz, and yet when he can't accept it because of a family engagement, he's the one that's thrown aside. And yet, it's the songs Idaho and Big Pretty Bridges that really push this record into something truly special for me. The former is a song about a hazy midnight drive. Open Mike Eagle's at the wheel with his friends all asleep in the car, and he fears that if he careens out of control, he could hurt his friends and never have the chance to actually deliver real parting words. It's a very lonely song, and only emphasized even further that feeling throughout this album with Big Pretty Bridges, a song that makes it very plain that Open Mike Eagle's trying to build a way through his words to connect the world and his fans around him in a meaningful way, to create something that matters, and so that others can attempt to understand the thoughts he expresses, that words cannot feel so inadequately expressing it. And then the entire record snaps into incredible focus. A man seeking to build meaningful connections, who has seen the industry's transparent contempt for those connections and tries to just comment on it and work around it by using a universal medium. Comedy. By making people laugh, he's bridging a gap, even though there's real truth and to some level a real deeper sadness to his words, because there's reality there. And it makes the awkward honesty of this record ring all the more powerfully, like on Sad Face Penance Raps and A History of Modern Dance, songs about attempted connections or truth so real that the track has to be cut off mid-line. And as a writer myself who has struggled to capture that perfect scene in my own fiction, to perhaps convey some deeper underlying truth, this record really struck something real for me as a creator myself. Sometimes it's really hard to articulate those thoughts that you are wanting and straining to get out, and you seek any medium possible. And sometimes it comes across as awkward, and sometimes it comes across as just, well, way too real. So yeah, if you have not checked out Open Mike Eagle's dark comedy, folks, you're missing out, because this is one of the most powerful and poignant records you're gonna hear this year across the board. And yet, it's got a certain absurdist charm to it that lowers the barrier to entry. It's not some big head-case record that's really hard to decipher. It's one that, on some level, anyone can enjoy. I'm not sure if this album is my favorite hip-hop record of the year thus far, but it's damn close. It gets a 9 out of 10 for me, an extremely high recommendation. Folks, this is smart, genuinely interesting, and well-presented hip-hop that never shies away from reality. And on that note, I cannot praise it high enough. Go buy this record so we can continue to praise the rappers and comedians who keep the hecklers away from the punchlines and away from the microphone, and maybe just make something special along the way. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. If there's any other albums coming out this year that you want me to take a look at, or there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'd be more than happy to hear it. But seriously, go check out this album. It's amazing. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.